All right, I have this friend. She's Canadian, but that's okay. She was born that way and we don't judge. She had studied French for 13 years in school when I met her. That was back when Ontario had grade 13. Shout out to all my double cohort U of T grads. After 13 years of French study, multiple hours a week in an ostensibly bilingual country, the best she could muster was bonjour. She couldn't hold a conversation, she couldn't express herself, and she wasn't even putting on a bad Anglo accent out of embarrassment. She was just totally unable to express herself verbally in French. She kept going up a grade because she could read and listen and even write if she had enough time. But she just couldn't translate that to speaking skills. And I hear this a lot. Let me know if you've heard this one. Or said it. I studied Spanish in high school for 4 years, and I still can't speak it. Or what about this one? I majored in French in college, and I read for fun, but I don't really speak French. I hear this kind of thing all the time. What's going on here? Well, today, we're going to figure out why so many people can study a language diligently for years and come away demoralized, timid, slow of tongue, and unable to produce all the grammar they know that they've learned, or any of the vocabulary. We'll talk about the root causes and then what you can actually do about it. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. I have a little leeway in which sponsors I match with which videos when I have sponsors. It's not every video. This one, I think, is a perfect match. Today's video is sponsored by Lingoda. Lingoda is an online language school. They have 5 languages: English, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. That's it. And they do them very well. They have online small group and one-on-one classes with native speakers basically 24/7, and content that goes from absolute beginner to C2 in the Common European Framework. They're not an app, it's literally a language school. They have a language sprint where you basically challenge yourself to learn an hour a day or every other day for a couple of months, and you get money back if you complete the challenge. I took their placement test, which recommended B2 in French, exactly what I'm actually certified at, and the content was brilliant. They have something like 50 class topics per Sefer level, and every class you're speaking and interacting the whole time. The trial class I took was taught by someone who also teaches at the Alliance Française, which administers the Sefer exams, and it was great. I was a little stressed out about formal class settings with a specific content benchmark, but honestly, I had a blast. And the instruction seamlessly worked in and reinforced specific grammatical concepts in a way that I was really impressed by. If I didn't have a PhD in linguistics, I probably wouldn't have noticed it. Their learning materials before and after the class are surprisingly glossy and high quality, and the classes themselves are fun. And they get you primed to be able to speak in your class, which you do a lot of, especially if it ends up one-on-one as my trial did. I have a promo code in my bio. And so if Lingoda sounds like a good fit for you, give it a shot. If you're serious about learning a language, like really learning a language to a high level, and it's one of those 5, this is absolutely what I would recommend. An hour a day, every day or most days for a few months, per Sefer level, with a well-designed course and patient native speaker feedback isn't a miracle potion, it's just putting in the actual work in a way that will get actual results. So check them out. So, what's the solution to the speaking block? You've studied for years. You've memorized 1,000,000 words. Okay, probably not 1,000,000, but like possibly tens of thousands. And when it comes time to speak, oof, it's all gone. If you're studying French or Russian, people will tell you to just go out and drink socially and your language will improve. But social alcoholism is not an effective long-term language strategy. There's something behind it, but I'll explain that in a minute. In order to correctly address the problem, we have to correctly diagnose the problem. What are its root causes? One of the root causes is that not all language use scenarios are the same. We can divide real-world language use into 4 categories. Often they overlap and you'll need all of them, but we can separate language use into recognition and production, and further separate them into reading and listening on the recognition side and writing and speaking on the production side. These are not the same things. They often don't even use the same parts of the brain. First, recognition is way easier than production. Recognition happens before conscious thought. Your amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, they all process this stuff, whether you've seen or heard something before, way before your prefrontal cortex ever kicks in, if it ever does. Someone with a neuroscience background can leave me a comment, but I'm pretty sure your amygdala and hippocampus process things, including words, before even your Wernicke's area and Broca's area, the language centers of the brain, kick in. Production relies on lexical retrieval, where there's an entire morass of scientific literature. But basically, the neural connections you have, the strength of those connections, and how a concept or other stimulus can affect the activation of those connections is where it's all at. And it's not all or nothing. So there's lots of studies on the tip of the tongue effect or partial lexical retrieval, the effect of semantic or lexical priming, the presence of distractors, and so on. And that's before we get to social inhibitions like Krashen or Labov discuss, usually referring to them as some form of monitor. And lexical retrieval isn't the whole picture. You have to be able to use the right morphological and syntactic structures. There's just a lot more going on under the hood. Second, not all recognition and production is the same. If you're reading, you have plenty of time to figure out what a word is and go back and restart the sentence. If someone is speaking, those fucking sounds just keep coming. You can pause and rewind with digital media, but if you're talking to a person and not listening to a podcast, good luck with that. When I've tried it, people get offended. Pause. Pause. And it's worse for production. If you're writing, you can go to Google Translate, you can check a grammar reference, and you can take as much time as you need. If you're in conversation, you actually have to generate spoken language within a reasonable time frame, or it's just excruciating for your listener. And if you're at all attuned to other people's mental and emotional states, not everybody is, then this becomes a stressor. It literally stresses you out. Side note here, but that kicks the amygdala and hypothalamus and other areas of the brain into high gear and basically takes away bandwidth. You know how your peripheral vision closes in when you're afraid? Same idea here. And if your lizard brain, not the scientific term for it, is using all its bandwidth on being stressed out about the social interaction, you literally have less bandwidth for recognizing words and stuff, let alone lexical retrieval and motor control for speaking. And third, most of us don't train production with any kind of strategy or benchmarks for progress. We stay in our comfort zone and avoid going beyond it to where we just faceplant over and over again. This is going to sound kind of like therapy. I guess anyway. I rejected sponsorship money from BetterHelp after reading up on them, so my therapist is just like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Dr. K YouTube videos. But I imagine this is like therapy, and that we'll need some cognitive reframing so that we're comfortable with the learning experience, which pretty much always includes attempt, failure, reassess, train, attempt again, rinse and repeat. So to summarize the issues as I see them, language learning encompasses multiple different skills, and lexical retrieval and speech production are by far the hardest. When we want to speak, our brains have to do way more, and we're often under social stress on top of that. It's just genuinely more stuff for your brain to handle. Not only is it more stuff, but in traditional schooling, it's often an afterthought. You get an oral production exam, but not a lot of actual targeted practice with guided feedback in a controlled environment that takes away all the nerves. And even those of us who do aim to speak more don't always have a study method targeted to assist in lexical retrieval and speech production under realistic time constraints. So how do we fix it? That's why you're all still watching, right? Well, like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications, and now I'll tell you. We have a few different things to address. You need sufficient vocabulary and grammar. You need to address your stress level. And you need to have lexical retrieval and grammar at speed. This is doable. First, vocab. For vocabulary, that's just the science of memory, which there's a lot of research on. Different people learn different ways, so I really like spaced repetition software, and I ensure that I'm following best practices like multimodality, including audio where possible and images. Having images, even if they're not particularly memorable on their own, still can boost retention, minimize learning and memorizing time, and give your brain just more neural connections to draw on. I'm also a huge fan of what I call naughty mnemonics. Things that kick your amygdala into high gear help you memorize. This includes sex, violence, and strong emotions. Basically, what the algorithm uses to manipulate your brain and keep you watching YouTube. You're just putting it to good use. Gabriel Weiner has written about this, and he's where I first learned about it. Let's just say I don't always review my Anki deck on the subway if there's someone sitting behind me. I should note that other people may have different preferences. I mentioned in my video about Stephen Krashen that people with ADHD might be particularly best served by Krashen's approach of just massive amounts of comprehensible input. Basically, leisure reading and podcasts and shows at your current level, plus one new thing. Past a beginner intermediate stage, I find this really beneficial myself. For instance, I had learned taraf in Persian when I was doing a 3-month challenge a while ago, which I learned as way or side. But I heard taraf-e padarash on a podcast, and I could feel my brain light up at the connection when I heard on his father's side. I'd learned prati and ishi as personal in Hebrew on Duolingo, and I already knew Chaim was life, but when I heard Doron on Piece of Hebrew say Chaim Yishim, I felt that same buzz of connections forming. Private life. And part of the benefit of this kind of engagement is that research demonstrates repeatedly that language learners are often reluctant to put together pieces they know go together in their language, father's side, private life, but they're not certain if you can say that in your target language. But I think it's obvious to most that you can't speak if you don't know any words. So let's say you've got some words. The second step is you have to be able to generate them. This means you need to go from concept or second best, and this will slow you down, the word in your first language, to making sounds out your mouth hole. Your brain being the intermediary. The way I train this with spaced repetition and flashcards is to have an image, possibly accompanied by your first language prompt, and the task is to generate the word or phrase in your target language. There's two key components here. First, it has to be correct, not mostly correct. So you have to be honest with yourself. If I'm trying to remember a word like amener and I say amener, that's not good enough. Second, it needs to be under a second to speech. I made this mistake learning Persian. I would eventually produce the correct answer, and it's all rattling around in my brain, but it might take up to 3 or even 5 seconds, and that's excruciating for a listener. I'm now aiming for 20 milliseconds from prompt to production. I'm not timing it aggressively, but that's the goal. How long is 20 milliseconds? It's the T sound when I say the word butter. Ra, ra, ra. You don't have to use flashcards for this, by the way. When I walk around, I try to talk to myself about what I'm seeing or what I just read or whatever, but I babble like an idiot. I also then fill in the gaps. When I don't know how to say something, I might stop and note it for later so I can learn how to say it. The third component is fitting things into the appropriate grammatical frames, and I chose those words very specifically. The more patterns, or as a lot of psycholinguists call them, chunks, the more of those that you have, the easier it is. Instead of trying to select, conjugate, decline, and arrange all your words one by one, you should have a ton of sentence frames, easy patterns, memorized, especially filler and discourse particles and so on. So while I'm gathering my thoughts in French, I can be on complete autopilot, like a native speaker saying, ah, bon, alors, à mon avis, and that buys me the time to be picking my actual words. All of the above will help with the fourth part, de-stress. The reason people suggest you get plastered is because alcohol lowers inhibitions. Remember Krashen's monitor? And makes some people more willing to make mistakes and less aware that they've even done so. It's like beer goggles for your mouth. Leave me a comment with a better way I could have phrased that. Another way to de-stress is, of course, repeated exposure in a controlled environment. That's why people tell you to just find a girlfriend or a boyfriend who speaks the language. When I was studying Chinese actively and when I was studying Russian, like for a little bit, an unbelievable number of people encouraged me to just get a mail-order bride or get in a relationship with someone who needed a green card, which is absolutely unhinged advice. A better course of action than literal human trafficking is just a language exchange. If you go the paid route, you don't have to waste half your time teaching the other person, and they're there specifically to help you out. And if you do something like Lingoda, see it all fits together, you get a ton of practice and feedback in a low-stress environment, so when you finally are out in the wild, you've had a ton of practice just talking. All this is to say that your training should match your desired application. If you do not practice lexical retrieval and structuring sentences in real time with appropriate filler and discourse particles and with a real person, you shouldn't be surprised if you don't magically develop that skill set doing something completely different. Finally, a word on AI tutors. Don't.
Don't.
AI speaking practice tutors are a cash grab based on taking your anxiety around speaking to a real person and selling you a solution. The solution is not giving you the skills to do so. It's paying money to talk to an inanimate object and pretending you're addressing your real anxiety. You could just as easily adapt my talk to myself tip from above and talk to your toaster or your wallet or whatever and save the subscription fee for a service like, let's call them Leap Talk or Spring Say, Hop Rap. Whatever, you know who I'm actually talking about. So if you're struggling to speak, especially if you studied for a while, and you know the vocab and grammar, give these tips a try. I personally found that I was nowhere near as fast at generating words as I thought I was, even though I knew them. And let me know how it works for you, by the way. If you want to try Lingoda for any of the 5 languages they offer, link in the description. And if this video was helpful to you, please think about sharing it with a friend or someone you think could benefit from it. And once you've thought about it, share it already. I want to thank all of my patrons. You can become one at patreon.com/languagejones, or you can support the channel right here on YouTube with super thanks and super chat. If you liked this video, YouTube thinks that you'll enjoy this one. Until next time, happy learning and get out there and talk.